It was an ordinary morning at the bustling courthouse, the kind of place where justice was served and lives were changed forever. The air inside the courtroom was thick with anticipation, as it always was when a case reached its pivotal moment. The judge, a man known for his firm but fair demeanor, adjusted his glasses and prepared to hear the next case. He had no idea his life was about to take an unimaginable turn. The courtroom was packed, with every seat occupied by lawyers, reporters, and curious onlookers. At the center of it all sat a young black girl, no older than 7 or 8, her brown eyes wide and brimming with an unspoken determination. She clutched a small, worn teddy bear tightly to her chest, her fingers tracing the frayed edges of its ears. Beside her was a social worker, a kind-faced woman who occasionally bent down to whisper comforting words into the girl's ear. Everyone in the room was focused on the case at hand, a complex custody dispute that had dragged on for months. The little girl, Amara, had been shuffled between foster homes after her mother's tragic death in a car accident. Her father, the identity of whom had remained a mystery, was the unanswered question looming over her young life. But Amara wasn't like most children her age. She had a quiet strength about her, a courage that seemed to defy her years. As the proceedings began, the judge called for order, his voice steady and authoritative. "We're here today to determine the best course of action for the welfare of this child," he said, glancing briefly at Amara before turning his attention to the attorneys. The room settled into a tense silence as the first lawyer began to speak, outlining the facts of the case. Yet, it wasn't the arguments or the evidence that would make this day unforgettable. It was what Amara was about to do. Amara had spent the past weeks listening to grown-ups talk about her life as if she wasn't even in the room. They debated her future, tossed around terms like placement and suitability, while she sat quietly, her thoughts spinning with questions. But today was different. Today she had something to say, and she wasn't going to let anyone speak over her. As the lawyer continued his statement, Amara suddenly stood up. Her small stature made her seem even more fragile in the cavernous courtroom. But her voice was steady and clear when she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her words slicing through the air like a knife. Heads turned, and murmurs rippled through the audience. The judge looked up, startled, his gavel suspended midair. "Yes, young lady," the judge said, his tone softening as he addressed her. Amara took a deep breath, clutching her teddy bear tighter. She pointed directly at the judge, her small finger trembling slightly but unwavering. "You're my dad," she said, her voice carrying an undeniable conviction. The room fell into a stunned silence. You could have heard a pin drop. The judge's expression froze, his normally composed demeanor replaced by a mix of shock and confusion. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stopped, the weight of Amara's words hanging heavily in the air. The social worker's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. The attorneys exchanged bewildered glances, unsure of what to make of the sudden revelation. And the judge, he simply stared at Amara, his face a blank canvas of emotions too complex to decipher. Amara didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the judge, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. She had been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it in her mind for days. She didn't know how he would react, but she knew she had to say it. It was the truth, and the truth couldn't wait any longer. The judge finally cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. I'm sorry, what did you say?" he asked, leaning forward as if he hadn't heard her correctly. But he had heard her. Everyone had. "I said you're my dad," Amara repeated, her tone firm and unyielding. "I know you are." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. No one dared to move or speak, as if afraid that any sound might shatter the fragile moment. The judge looked at Amara, his eyes searching hers for answers he wasn't ready to find. Questions raced through his mind. How could this be true? Who was this child, and why did she believe he was her father? As the silence stretched on, Amara's lip quivered, but she stood her ground. "I've seen your picture," she said softly, her voice now tinged with vulnerability. Mama had it in her box of special things. She told me about you before she went away. The judge's hands trembled as he removed his glasses, placing them on the bench in front of him. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to process the impossible. Memories he had long buried began to resurface, fragments of a past he had worked so hard to forget. The courtroom remained frozen, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. No one knew what would happen next, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, a low hum of whispers and exchanged glances. Everyone was processing what they had just heard, yet all eyes remained fixed on the judge. He sat there, his normally composed face betraying the storm of emotions within him. The weight of Amara's words pressed down on him like a boulder, each syllable reverberating in his mind. The judge, whose name was Marcus Bennett, had spent years building a reputation as a no-nonsense man of the law. He was meticulous, principled, and entirely dedicated to his work. But behind the polished exterior, there were parts of his life he kept locked away, pieces of a puzzle he didn't want anyone to see. Now, with a single sentence from a little girl, those hidden pieces were threatening to come to light. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the bench as if to steady himself. He studied Amara's face, searching for something familiar. Her dark, curly hair framed her small face, and her large brown eyes shone with a mixture of hope and defiance. There was something about her expression, a flicker of recognition that unsettled him. But it couldn't be, could it? The lawyers exchanged hushed words, unsure how to proceed. The social worker, a woman named Linda, knelt beside Amara and whispered softly, "Sweetheart, are you sure about this? Do you want to sit down and talk later?" Amara shook her head firmly, her small hands still clutching the teddy bear. "I'm sure," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a deep yearning. "He's my dad. I know he is." Marcus tried to focus, his mind racing. He had no recollection of ever meeting Amara or her mother. His past relationships had been few and far between, and none of them, as far as he knew, had resulted in a child. He had always been careful, always made sure his life outside the courtroom remained uncomplicated. But Amara's words triggered a faint, nagging memory, a face, a moment, something buried deep in the recesses of his mind. Taking a deep breath, Marcus spoke, his voice carefully measured. "Amara," he began, addressing the child directly for the first time. "I need you to tell me how you came to believe on your father. It's very important that we understand everything." Amara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the teddy bear. She glanced at Linda, who nodded encouragingly. With a shaky breath, she began to explain. "Mama told me," Amara said, her voice quiet but steady. "She showed me a picture of you once. She said you were someone important, and that you didn't know about me. She said it wasn't your fault." Marcus's heart clenched at her words. He couldn't imagine what kind of life this child had led, what kind of loss she had endured. He studied her closely, searching for clues in her demeanor, in her words. The more she spoke, the more his confusion grew. "What picture?" Marcus asked gently. "Can you describe it to me?" Amara nodded. "It was black and white," she said. "You were wearing a suit, and Mama said it was taken a long time ago." She kept it in her special box with all her important things. Linda chimed in softly, her voice full of compassion. "Amara's mother passed away in a car accident about 8 months ago, Your Honor. Since then, Amara has been in foster care. We've been trying to locate any family members, but the search has been unsuccessful." Marcus felt a pang of guilt and sorrow. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Amara, losing her mother and being thrust into the foster system. But the idea that he could somehow be connected to her was almost too much to process. As Amara continued to speak, she described moments from her life, fragments of conversations with her mother, stories her mother had told her about a man who worked hard and believed in justice. "She said you were a good man," Amara added softly. "She said you would have helped us if you knew." Marcus's throat tightened. He couldn't reconcile her words with his own memories. Could he have been so blind, so unaware of something so monumental? He glanced at the lawyers, who were now whispering frantically, likely trying to determine the legal implications of this revelation. "Linda," Marcus said, turning to the social worker, "has there been any effort to verify this claim? Any documentation, any photographs that could help us understand the situation?" Linda shook her head. "Not yet, Your Honor. We've been focusing on ensuring Amara's safety and well-being. This is the first time she's brought this up in a formal setting." Amara's voice cut through the tension once more. "Mama always said you didn't know about me because she didn't tell you. She said she wanted to, but she didn't know how. And then she was gone." The courtroom grew silent again, the weight of Amara's words sinking in. Marcus struggled to maintain his composure, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and disbelief. Could it be true? Could this little girl somehow be his daughter? The possibility felt both surreal and terrifying. "I need some time," Marcus finally said, his voice heavy. "This is a matter that requires careful consideration." He glanced at Amara, his eyes softening. "Amara, I want you to know something. No matter what happens, we'll make sure you're taken care of. You deserve that." Amara nodded, her expression unreadable. But there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, a glimmer of trust she hadn't shown before. As Marcus adjourned the court for a recess, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. The mystery of Amara's claim hung over him like a dark cloud, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. He would have to confront his past, unravel the truth, and face whatever it revealed. For now, though, the courtroom remained a place of unanswered questions and unresolved tension. And in the center of it all sat a little girl with a teddy bear, waiting for the father she had always hoped would find her. As the court recessed, the room slowly began to empty, though the heavy atmosphere lingered like an unspoken question no one dared to answer. Amara stayed seated, a small-framed dwarf by the large wooden bench. Linda knelt beside her, speaking softly, but Amara's gaze was locked on the judge's bench where Marcus had been sitting. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she spoke up. But now that the moment had passed, a strange nervousness began to creep into her chest. What if she had made a mistake? What if he wasn't her dad? Marcus retreated to his chambers, his head spinning. He paced back and forth, replaying Amara's words over and over again. The mention of the photograph stuck with him. A black and white picture. A suit. None of it rang a bell, and yet there was a gnawing feeling deep inside him, as if some long-forgotten memory was trying to surface. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus. This wasn't the kind of problem he could solve with logic or legal precedent. This was personal, painfully personal. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over one name for a moment too long. Diana. It had been years since he last spoke to her, but if anyone could offer clarity, it was her. Diana was his closest friend from law school, someone who had always been brutally honest with him, whether he liked it or not. Taking a deep breath, he tapped her name and waited as the phone rang. Marcus. Came her familiar voice on the other end, a mix of curiosity and concern. This is unexpected. I need your help, Marcus said, his voice strained. It's complicated. Isn't it always with you? She teased lightly, but her tone softened when she heard the seriousness in his voice. What's going on? Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to explain everything without sounding like he had completely lost his mind. There's a little girl in my courtroom, he began, and she claims I'm her father. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Diana spoke again. Wait, what? Are you saying? I don't know, Diana. Marcus interrupted, his frustration bubbling over. I don't know who she is or why she thinks this, but she says her mother told her. She described a picture of me. It's throwing me completely off balance. Diana's tone grew serious. Marcus, is there any chance at all, that this could be true? Think back. Could there have been someone you were involved with, maybe years ago? Marcus sank into his chair, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I've been trying to think," he admitted, "but nothing makes sense. I've always been careful. And even if I wasn't, wouldn't I have known? Wouldn't someone have told me?" Diana sighed on the other end. "Sometimes people keep secrets, Marcus. Sometimes they think they're protecting someone by staying silent. But if this little girl is telling the truth, you owe it to her and to yourself to find out." Marcus knew she was right, but the thought of delving into his past was daunting. He had spent so much of his life focused on his career, on doing things the right way, that he had rarely looked back. But now the past was staring him in the face, and it refused to be ignored. Meanwhile, in the courtroom lobby, Amara sat quietly with Linda, her little legs swinging off the edge of the bench. A kind-looking woman approached them, introducing herself as one of the court-appointed counselors. She crouched down to Amara's level, a smile warm and inviting. "Hi, Amara," she said gently. "My name is Miss Janine. Can I talk to you for a little bit?" Amara nodded hesitantly, clutching her teddy bear. Janine sat beside her, keeping her voice soft and friendly. "That was very brave of you, speaking up like that. Not many kids would have the courage to do what you did." Amara shrugged. "Mama always said to tell the truth, no matter what." Janine smiled. "Your mama sounds like she was a very wise woman. Can you tell me a little more about her? What was she like?" Amara's face lit up as she began to talk about her mother. "She was the best," she said. "She used to sing to me every night before bed. And she made the yummiest pancakes on Sundays. She said they were magic pancakes because they always made me smile, even when I was sad." Janine listened intently, nodding as Amara spoke. "It sounds like she loved you very much," she said. "And she told you about your dad?" Amara nodded again. "She said he was a good man, and he didn't know about me. She said it wasn't his fault." Janine glanced at Linda, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Do you remember anything else she said about him?" Janine asked gently. "Anything that might help us understand more?" Amara thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "She said he worked a lot," she said finally. "That he was always helping people. And she said he was smart, like really, really smart." Janine's eyes softened. "And you believe that man is Judge Bennett?" Amara looked down at her teddy bear, her fingers tracing the worn fabric. "I don't just believe it," she said quietly. "I know it. Mama wouldn't lie." Back in his chambers, Marcus stared at an old photo album he had pulled from the depths of his office. It was filled with pictures from his early career, moments he hadn't thought about in years. As he flipped through the pages, a familiar face caught his eye. A woman he had known briefly, someone he had met during a summer internship long ago. Her name was Grace. She had been warm, funny, and full of life. They had spent a few months together before parting ways, their lives taking them in different directions. The memory hit him like a tidal wave. Could Grace be Amara's mother? Could this be the connection he had missed all these years? His hands trembled as he stared at the photo, his mind racing with questions. If Grace was her mother, why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept this a secret? As the day wore on, Marcus knew he couldn't leave things unresolved. He needed answers, and he needed them now. But the deeper he delved into the mystery, the more he realized that the truth might be more complicated than he could ever imagine. The hours after the courtroom recess felt like days to Marcus. He couldn't concentrate on anything else. The photograph of Grace from his old album stayed on his desk, a silent reminder of the questions swirling in his mind. Could it really be her? Grace had always been kind and compassionate, the kind of person who lit up a room just by walking into it. But they had lost touch so long ago. Why wouldn't she have told him if she had been pregnant? Why would she keep his child a secret? Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Linda, her expression cautious but determined. She stepped into his chambers, closing the door softly behind her. "Judge Bennett," she began, her tone professional but tinged with empathy. "I wanted to check in with you before we proceed tomorrow. I know this is an unusual situation, and I can't imagine what you must be feeling right now. Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Unusual doesn't even begin to cover it, he admitted, rubbing his temples. Linda, I need to know more about Amara's life. Her mother, everything. Linda hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to say. Amara's mother, Grace, was a wonderful woman from what I've gathered, she said. She worked multiple jobs to make sure Amara was cared for. They didn't have much, but Grace did everything she could to give her daughter a happy childhood. Marcus leaned forward, his heart aching at the thought of Grace struggling alone. And there's no one else? No other family? He asked. Linda shook her head. Grace's parents passed away years ago, and as far as we can tell, there are no other close relatives. Amara's been through a lot since her mother's accident. She's been in 2 foster homes already, and it's been hard for her. The weight of her words settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. The thought of Amara, so small and vulnerable, navigating such a harsh system made his chest tighten. He needed to know if there was truth to her claim, not just for his sake, but for hers. Linda, he said after a moment, his voice steady. Is there any way to verify this? A DNA test, something definitive. We can arrange that, Linda replied, but it will take time. In the meantime, I think Amara could benefit from spending some time with you. It might help her feel more secure. Marcus's eyes widened. Spending time with me? I'm not sure that's appropriate given the circumstances. Linda gave him a reassuring smile. It doesn't have to be formal. Just a chance for you to get to know her, and for her to see that she's not alone. I think it could make a big difference. Marcus hesitated. The idea of spending time with a child who might be his daughter was overwhelming. But he also knew he couldn't ignore the possibility. All right, he said finally, let's do it. The following day, Marcus found himself sitting across from Amara in a small private room adjacent to the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense, but Amara seemed calmer than before, her teddy bear still clutched tightly in her hands. Hi, Amara, Marcus said, his voice softer than usual. How are you feeling? Amara shrugged, her eyes fixed on the table. Okay, I guess. Marcus leaned forward slightly, trying to meet her gaze. I want you to know that I'm here to listen. If there's anything you want to tell me, anything at all, I'm here. Amara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Do you remember my mama? She asked quietly. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. I think so, he said after a moment. I remember someone named Grace. She was very special. A small smile flickered across Amara's face. She always said you were special too. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He didn't know what to say, how to process the emotions swirling inside him. All he could do was nod, his throat too tight to speak. For the next hour, they talked about Amara's favorite books, her love of drawing, and the songs her mother used to sing to her. Marcus listened intently, absorbing every word, every detail. The more he learned, the more he felt a connection to this little girl, who might just be his daughter. But the lingering doubts wouldn't let go. Marcus knew they couldn't move forward without answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at him like a persistent ache. When the meeting ended, he promised Amara that they would talk again soon. She gave him a shy smile before leaving with Linda, her teddy bear swinging at her side. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his study, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He picked up the phone and called Diana again, his voice heavy with emotion. I think she might be mine, he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I don't know how, but I feel it. Diana's voice was calm but firm. Then you need to find out, Marcus. Get the test done, but more than that, be there for her. She's been through enough. Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him. You're right, he said. I'll do whatever it takes. But as he hung up the phone, a new wave of uncertainty washed over him. What if the truth wasn't what he hoped? What if he wasn't her father? Or worse, what if he was, and he had unknowingly failed her all these years? The questions swirled in his mind as the night stretched on, the answers just out of reach. Marcus knew the moment of truth was coming, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay ahead would change his life forever. Marcus barely slept that night. The weight of the conversation with Amara and the uncertainty of her claim felt like a storm brewing inside him. By the time the sun rose, he had made up his mind. He would push for the DNA test immediately. It wasn't just about him anymore. Amara deserved to know the truth, and so did he. But just as he began drafting the paperwork to expedite the process, his phone buzzed with a message from Linda. The message was brief but unsettling. Asterisk, asterisk, we need to talk. There's been a development, asterisk, asterisk. Marcus's chest tightened as he stared at the screen. Linda's tone was calm, but he could sense the urgency behind her words. Within the hour, they were seated in her office, where she handed him a file. Her expression was serious, almost cautious, as though she was preparing him for something he wouldn't want to hear. Marcus, Linda began carefully, I've been doing some digging into Grace's past, trying to piece together anything that could help us understand this situation. But what I found complicates things. He opened the file, scanning the contents. At first, the information seemed routine: addresses, old employment records, medical reports. But then his eyes fell on a name that made his heart skip a beat. Asterisk, asterisk, Michael Calloway, asterisk, asterisk. Who is this? Marcus asked, his voice low but tense. Linda folded her hands on the desk. Michael Calloway was Grace's longtime friend, or at least that's how most people saw him. But according to several records and testimonies, he was more involved in Grace's life than anyone realized. He helped her financially, visited regularly, and seemed to have a strong bond with Amara. Some even thought he might be Amara's biological father. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the air suddenly thick with tension. Are you saying this man could be her father? I'm saying we don't know for sure, Linda replied. But his name kept coming up. He passed away a year ago, which might explain why Grace never revealed the truth. If he was involved, maybe she wanted to protect his memory, or maybe there's more to the story. The revelation hit Marcus like a wave. He had spent the last few days grappling with the idea that Amara might be his daughter, only to learn there could be someone else in the picture, a man who was no longer alive to answer the questions piling up. The mystery was deepening, and the stakes felt higher than ever. But there was more. Linda hesitated, her voice softening. There's something else you should know. Before Michael passed, he filed a handwritten letter with a local attorney. It mentions Grace and Amara. I'm working on getting access to it, but it's going to take time. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. A letter? What could Michael have written? And why would it involve Amara? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more urgent than the last. Meanwhile, across town, Amara sat in her foster home, flipping through a small photo album her mother had given her. It was one of the few belongings she had left, and she carried it everywhere. As she traced her fingers over a picture of her mother, she whispered softly, Mama, why didn't you tell him sooner? Why did you wait? The foster mother, Mrs. Whittaker, noticed her quiet contemplation and knelt beside her. Amara, sweetie, you okay? Amara nodded but didn't look up. Do you think he remembers, Mama? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whittaker gave her a kind smile. I think he's trying to figure it all out, just like you are. It's a lot to take in, but you're very brave for telling the truth. Amara looked down at her hands, clutching the photo album tighter. I just want a family, she said softly. I didn't want to be alone anymore. Back in his chambers, Marcus couldn't shake the unease growing inside him. The revelation about Michael Calloway had thrown everything into question, but it also made him more determined than ever to uncover the truth. He picked up the phone and called Linda again. Can we arrange to speak with Amara's foster family? He asked. I want to see that photo album she keeps mentioning. Linda agreed, and later that afternoon, they met with Mrs. Whittaker. Amara was shy at first, hiding behind her teddy bear as she clutched the worn album to her chest. But when Marcus knelt down and spoke to her softly, she eventually handed it to him. As he flipped through the pages, his heart raced. The pictures of Grace were as vivid as his memories. her warm smile, her kind eyes. But then he came across something unexpected. A photograph of Grace with Michael Calloway. They were standing close together, smiling brightly, and Amara was just a baby in Grace's arms. "This is him?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but strained. Amara nodded. "That's Uncle Michael," she said. "He used to read me stories and tell me Mama's favorite jokes. He was really funny." Marcus's chest tightened. There was no mistaking the connection between Grace and Michael. But what did it mean? Had Grace kept the truth from both of them? Or had Michael been a father figure to Amara without actually being her father? The questions felt endless, and the answers seemed further away than ever. But one thing was clear. Marcus couldn't stop now. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth was closer than it had ever been. All he had to do was reach for it, no matter where it led. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the unusual case, and now every seat was filled with curious spectators eager to witness what many whispered would be the revelation of a lifetime. Marcus sat at the judge's bench, but this time his usual air of authority was replaced by a quiet tension. The DNA test results had arrived, and they would finally bring answers to the questions that had consumed everyone involved. Linda stood at her desk, holding the sealed envelope in her hand. The room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes every heartbeat feel deafening. Amara sat near the front, her small frame almost swallowed by the large chair, but her eyes were locked on Marcus. She wasn't holding her teddy bear today. Instead, her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, as if bracing for whatever was to come. "Your Honor," Linda began, addressing Marcus directly. "Before we proceed with opening the results, I'd like to submit an additional document for the court's consideration." She gestured to a man standing by the door, who walked forward with a folded piece of paper. Marcus immediately recognized it. It was the letter Michael Calloway had left behind. Linda handed it to Marcus, her expression serious. This letter was recently retrieved from Michael Calloway's attorney. It may provide some context for what we're about to learn. Marcus unfolded the letter, his hands steady, but his heart racing. As he read, the words seemed to blur together, each sentence more shocking than the last. The room remained silent as he lowered the paper, his face pale. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but strained. This letter reveals that Michael Calloway believed Amara might not be his biological daughter. While he loved Grace deeply and supported her as much as he could, he suspected there was someone else in Grace's life. A man she never spoke of, but held close to her heart. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Marcus raised a hand to quiet the crowd, his mind racing. Could Grace have been protecting him all along? Was it possible that she had never told him about Amara to shield him from the truth, or to keep him from feeling the guilt of not being there? Linda stepped forward again, her tone gentle. "Your Honor, perhaps it's time we open the DNA results. This will give us the clarity we need." Marcus nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he took the envelope. With the entire courtroom watching, he carefully tore it open and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. His eyes scanned the results, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "She's my daughter," Marcus said, his voice breaking as he spoke the words. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, but Marcus only had eyes for Amara. Her expression shifted from confusion to joy, and for the first time, tears filled her eyes. Amara stood, hesitating for a moment before running toward Marcus. He stepped down from the bench, meeting her halfway, and as she wrapped her small arms around him, the courtroom seemed to fade away. "I knew it," she whispered into his chest. "I knew you were my dad." Marcus held her "There's tightly, one more thing we his need heart to swelling address," with emotions she he said, hadn't let himself turned feel brave. in years. Marcus But turned just to as her, the moment settled, still holding Linda Amara spoke close. again, her voice The letter cutting through
also
the charged
mentioned
air.
something
about Grace's accident. Michael believed it wasn't an accident at all. The room fell silent again, the joyous atmosphere replaced by a chilling tension. Marcus's brow furrowed as he processed Linda's words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. Linda hesitated, clearly aware of the weight of what she was about to say. Michael suspected that someone might have been trying to harm Grace. He didn't have proof, but he mentioned strange incidents before her death. Phone calls, shadowy figures near their home, and threats that Grace dismissed as misunderstandings. The courtroom buzzed with speculation, and Marcus felt his protective instincts surge. He looked down at Amara, who clung to him tightly, and silently vowed to get to the bottom of it. Grace's death had been ruled an accident, but now the idea that someone might have caused it opened a new chapter of questions and uncertainties. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom that day, holding Amara's hand tightly in his, he knew their journey was far from over. He had found his daughter, but the shadows of the past still lingered, and the truth about Grace's death remained hidden. For now, though, he had Amara, and that was enough to give him the strength to face whatever came next.